I had always believed I was done with the high-stakes world of corporate investigations. I had spent years unraveling fraud, deceit, and criminal behavior in the most cutthroat industries. But something inside me snapped one night. After a particularly brutal case that nearly broke me, I realized I needed a change. I couldn't keep living on the edge like that, consumed by the thrill of danger and the constant need to stay one step ahead of the criminals I investigated. So, I packed up, sold off what I could, and moved to Austin, Texas, where I opened my own detective agency. I thought I was ready for the peaceful life. For the first time in years, I envisioned a future where I didn't wake up in a cold sweat, wondering who might come after me or what case would push me to the brink. But it didn't take long before I realized the quiet life I had imagined was far from the reality I was facing. Trouble, it seemed, had a way of following me. My wife, Clara, was excited about the change. She had always been supportive, but I could tell there was something different in her eyes as we settled into our new life. It was subtle at first, small things. She would disappear into her phone, always typing, but never telling me who she was talking to. I brushed it off at first. Maybe she was just getting used to the shift, the new pace of life. But as the days went on, I noticed the little cracks, her distance, her silence when I asked about her day. I tried to talk to her about it, tried to bridge the gap that had started to form between us, but it never seemed to help. She would just say, "I'm fine, Ryan," with that smile, the one that no longer reached her eyes. It used to comfort me, but now it only made me uneasy. There was something she wasn't telling me. But Clara wasn't the only one keeping secrets. I had my own demons to deal with. The cases I took on weren't as simple as I'd hoped. Divorce cases, cheating spouses, missing persons. All of them required me to dive deeper into the lives of people who would do anything to hide the truth. It didn't take long for me to realize that the line between professional and personal was blurring faster than I anticipated. One morning, as I sat down at my desk reviewing the files of a new client, Janine Larkin, a woman seeking proof of her husband's infidelity, something clicked. The case was straightforward enough, but Janine's face, the desperation in her eyes, reminded me too much of my own situation with Clara. It was unsettling. Janine's story was familiar. She had a suspicion that her husband, Evan Larkin, a local psychologist, was cheating. He'd become distant, spent too much time at work, and his behavior had changed in subtle yet telling ways. As she spoke, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. It was almost as if she were describing Clara. The thought made my stomach churn. "How long have you suspected?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. It was the same question I had been asking myself for weeks about Clara. "About 6 months," Janine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the little things. His phone off when I try to call him during lunch, the way he avoids me at home like he's somewhere else." I leaned back in my chair, trying to swallow the rising discomfort in my chest. I had heard it all before. The signs, the subtle shifts in behavior, the way someone starts to pull away. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. The question I had been avoiding for weeks about Clara seemed to hang in the air, unspoken. "Do you have any idea who it could be?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even, professional. I didn't want to let my own emotions cloud the investigation, but it was becoming harder by the minute. Janine's eyes darted to the side before she nodded slowly. "I think he's seeing someone at his office, someone who works with him." The room felt smaller suddenly. My chest tightened and I struggled to maintain my composure. There was no mistaking it. The signs were too familiar. Janine wasn't the only one with a problem, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the truth would be forced into the open. The question now wasn't whether Clara was cheating, because I was sure of it. It was about how far I was willing to go to find out the truth and what I would do when I had the evidence. I shook my head, clearing the fog in my mind. "I'll take the case. Give me 2 weeks. I'll get you the proof you need." As I saw Janine out, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut. The lines between professional and personal were already becoming dangerously blurred. What was I doing? Was I really ready to dive into this world again, to let my emotions guide me like I had with every case before? I had to focus. I had to keep my head in the game, even though my heart felt like it was being torn apart. I closed the door behind me and sat back down at my desk. The familiar weight of the investigation files in front of me grounded me. This was my new life now, solving other people's problems while pretending mine didn't exist. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder just how much longer I could keep pretending. The case was clear-cut. At least, that's what I thought when Janine first walked into my office. A distraught wife suspecting her husband's infidelity, looking for proof to back up her growing suspicions. I had done this hundreds of times before, but somehow this one felt different. The whole situation mirrored my own life too closely. Her desperation was too familiar. Janine was a striking woman, late 30s, her eyes red from sleepless nights, but still sharp and calculating. She wasn't the type to cry on command. She had the air of someone who had seen her fair share of hardship and refused to be crushed by it. The first time I met her, she barely spoke above a whisper, but every word she said weighed a ton. "I think my husband is cheating," she told me, her voice trembling just enough for me to catch the tension. The words hit harder than I expected, not because of her grief, but because I knew that exact feeling, the helplessness, the fear that gnawed at you every time you asked yourself if you were just imagining things. And there it was again, the creeping doubt that had settled into my own life, but I refused to acknowledge. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "What makes you think so?" "I've been married to him for almost 10 years, she said, her gaze unwavering. "He used to come home every night. We would have dinner, talk about our days. But lately, he's been distant. I found a strange perfume on his shirt, and when I asked him about it, he said it was from a client. But I know it wasn't mine. I knew the signs, the little things that never seemed to add up, the lies, the evasions. A part of me wanted to tell her to walk away, but that wasn't what I did. I wasn't a therapist or a marriage counselor. I was a private investigator, and my job was to get the facts, no matter how painful they were." "And you think he's seeing someone at work?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, trying not to show how much I felt connected to her pain. She nodded. "He's always been so careful, but recently he's started staying late. I can't reach him during lunch anymore, and when he's home, he's distracted. Not the same. I don't know if he's seeing someone else, but I need proof. I can't live with this doubt anymore." I could see the battle inside her, the need to trust her husband, yet the instinct to fight for her own peace of mind. It wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about reclaiming control of her life. I set the papers down and folded my hands in front of me. "I'll take the case," I said. "Give me 2 weeks. I'll get you the proof you need." Her face softened, but the relief was short-lived. "Thank you," she whispered, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just thanking me for the job. She was thanking me for giving her a lifeline, the kind of hope that only comes when you start to confront the truth head-on. After she left, I sat there for a long time. My mind kept drifting back to Clara. Could she be doing the same thing? Lying to me, hiding behind walls she'd built up in the last few months? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. I couldn't afford to let my personal life interfere with the case. I had a job to do. But it was hard to ignore the fact that Janine's pain mirrored my own. I spent the next few days gathering information on Dennis Larkin, Janine's husband. He was a psychologist, well known in the Austin area for his work with couples. His professional reputation was impeccable. Too perfect, in fact. That's usually a red flag for me. When everything appears perfect on the surface, that's when the cracks begin to show. One of the first things I learned was that Dennis had been facing a malpractice suit a year ago. The case was quickly dismissed, but the details were suspicious. A former patient of his had filed the suit claiming emotional distress, but the patient mysteriously withdrew it. Something didn't add up. I felt my gut tighten. This wasn't going to be just another run-of-the-mill infidelity case. There was something deeper here, and I was going to find it. That's when I called in Izzy. Isabella Moreno, my trusted assistant. She had been with me for a few years now, and I couldn't do any of this without her. Izzy was smart, sharp, and had a knack for digging into people's lives. She was the kind of person who could slip into any situation and get the job done without raising suspicion. We were partners, and when it came to finding the truth, she was invaluable. "Hey, Izzy," I said as she picked up the phone. "I need you to dig deeper into Dennis Larkin. He's hiding something." Izzy didn't hesitate. Got it. I'll start right away. Any leads you want me to focus on? I sighed, feeling the weight of the case settle on my shoulders. Everything. I need to know about the malpractice suit and any connections he might have to other women. If he's been manipulating Janine like I think he has, we need to expose him. The next few days were a blur of research, surveillance, and quiet conversations with people who had once crossed paths with Dennis. Everything pointed back to one thing. Dennis Larkin was a master manipulator. He preyed on vulnerable women, using his position as a therapist to exploit their trust. And, if I was right, Janine wasn't the first woman he had hurt. I sat back in my chair, staring at the evidence I had gathered. I had to be careful now. There were no guarantees in this line of work. But one thing was clear. Dennis Larkin wasn't going to get away with this. And as much as I tried to push it to the back of my mind, a part of me couldn't help but feel a sickening sense of déjà vu. Because somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't just Janine's story, it was mine too. The cracks in my marriage were becoming impossible to ignore. Clara had always been the one I could rely on, the one I could talk to after a long day, the one who understood me better than anyone. But now she felt like a stranger. The quiet dinners, the awkward silences, and the way she seemed to retreat into her phone whenever I was around, it all added up. Every night we'd sit across from each other at the dinner table, but the conversation was forced, strained. I found myself watching her more than I spoke, looking for any sign that she was still the woman I had married. But the woman sitting across from me wasn't the same. There were no more shared glances, no more inside jokes. It was like we were two strangers living in the same house. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She'd stay in the office late more often than not, and when she came home, she was distant. I couldn't even remember the last time we had an actual conversation. I started asking myself questions I never thought I would. Was it me? Had I done something to push her away? Or was it something else? I tried to convince myself that it was just the stress of the move, the new job, the unfamiliar city. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. One evening, I decided to confront her. I could feel my chest tightening as I walked into the living room where Clara was curled up on the couch, her attention fixed on her phone. She didn't even look up when I walked in. It was like I wasn't even there. "Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though I could feel the tension in my throat. "We need to talk." She looked up, her eyes a little too wide, like she hadn't been expecting me to speak. "What's wrong?" Her voice was soft, but there was a hardness beneath it, a barrier she had built up over time. "I don't know, you tell me," I replied, sitting down beside her. I needed to know what was happening, why things had changed so drastically. "You've been distant lately, and I'm starting to think it's more than just work stress. What's going on?" She shifted uncomfortably, looking down at her phone again before setting it aside. "Ryan, nothing's wrong. You're just overthinking it." "Am I? Because it feels like you've been pulling away from me for weeks now." The words slipped out before I could stop them. I hated the way I sounded, desperate, but I couldn't hold back anymore. "It's like you're shutting me out. I don't know what's happening, but I can't keep pretending I don't see it." Clara didn't say anything for a long time. I could see her struggling with something, but she wasn't ready to say it. Her lips parted, like she was about to speak, but then they closed again. "I'm sorry," she said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not the same person anymore." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had always believed we were a team, that no matter what came our way, we could face it together. But now, it felt like I was alone in this, alone in my own marriage. "Is there someone else?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like a cloud I couldn't ignore. It was the only thing that made sense, even if I didn't want it to be true. She froze, her gaze avoiding mine. It was enough. I could see the guilt in her eyes, even though she hadn't said a word. The silence between us was deafening. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. "Clara, if you're seeing someone else, just tell me. We can fix this or we can end it. But I can't keep living like this. Not knowing, not trusting you." My voice cracked, the anger and hurt mixing together in a way I didn't know how to control. "I'm not seeing anyone," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "It's just everything. Work, the move, The stress. She stood up then, walking over to me. Ryan, I love you. I'm just lost right now. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I want. The confession should have relieved some of the tension, but it only made things worse. There it was, an admission that she didn't know herself anymore, that we didn't even know each other anymore. And yet, she was still standing there telling me she loved me, while I was left wondering if love alone was enough to save this marriage. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I can't keep doing this, Clara. I need more than just words. I need to know you're here, with me. If not, I let the words trail off, too scared to say what I really meant. What if we couldn't fix this? She stepped closer, her hands reaching for mine, but I pulled away, not ready to forgive or forget. Not yet. Maybe we need space, I said, the words tasting bitter as I said them out loud. Her face fell, the sadness evident in her eyes. Do you really think that's what we need? Space? I don't know what we need anymore, Clara. I need some time to think. I turned and walked out of the room, unable to face the woman I had married anymore. I could hear her behind me, but I couldn't look back. I needed to clear my head. The walls were closing in, and I couldn't breathe with all this tension hanging over us. I felt like I was drowning, and Clara was too far away to reach. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions, with suspicions that gnawed at me. Was Clara having an affair? Had she fallen out of love with me? Or was there something else I wasn't seeing? One thing was for sure. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The truth, whatever it was already lurking in the shadows, and sooner or later it would come into the light. The unease that had been building for weeks finally became undeniable. It wasn't just Clara's silence or her increasing distance. It was the nagging feeling in my gut that kept me awake at night, the cold suspicion that something wasn't right. That afternoon, I decided to follow her. My mind raced with the idea that I was being paranoid, but every fiber in my being told me to trust my instincts. I had done it 100 times before in my work, tracking cheaters, uncovering lies, but this time it was different. This time, it was my life, my marriage. I waited until Clara left the house. I didn't say goodbye, didn't ask where she was going. She didn't look at me when she walked out. I barely heard the door close. I grabbed my keys, slipping out after her. My car moved through the streets of Austin like a shadow, staying just far enough behind. I kept my distance, pretending not to notice the familiar sense of dread creeping up my spine as I followed her. The weight of what I was doing was starting to sink in, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. She turned off the main road and pulled into the parking lot of a small, unmarked office building. My heart skipped a beat. I had never seen this place before. I parked a few spaces away and watched as Clara got out of the car, her posture stiff as if she was trying to act casual. I could see her glance over her shoulder like she was making sure no one was watching. I was fighting the urge to run to her, to confront her right then and there, but I knew I had to keep my cool. I wasn't here to jump to conclusions. I was here for proof. I waited until she disappeared inside before I got out of the car. I crept up to the building, moving as quietly as I could. The glass door was half shut, but I could still see through it. My stomach churned as I saw a man standing in the lobby, waiting for her. It wasn't just any man. It was Evan Larkin, the same therapist she had been seeing for the last few months, the same one I had read about when I was researching Janine's case. I felt my pulse quicken, my blood running cold. I watched as Clara greeted him with a smile, her eyes softening as she looked at him. There was no denying it. This was more than just therapy. She was too comfortable with him, too familiar. The door clicked behind me, and I snapped out of my thoughts. I had to move. I ducked behind a column, heart racing in my chest. I was too far in now to back out, too far gone to pretend I didn't know what was happening. I had already seen enough. I moved quickly to the back of the building, hoping to find a way inside without being seen. I didn't know what I was planning to do, but I knew I couldn't just stand there. As I rounded the corner, I saw an alleyway leading to a back door. It was slightly ajar. Without thinking, I slipped inside. I found myself in a narrow hallway, the sound of voices coming from an office at the end. I could hear Clara's laughter, low and genuine. It hit me like a slap to the face. This was happening. My wife was laughing with another man who wasn't me, another man who was supposed to be helping her, not whatever this was. I crept closer, my feet barely making a sound as I approached the door. I peeked through the crack, my breath catching in my throat. There they were, sitting too close to one another. Evan's hand was on Clara's shoulder. It was an innocent gesture, but the way she leaned into him, the way her body relaxed, it made my stomach turn. She was leaning into him like she used to lean into me. "I just don't know how to fix things with Ryan," Clara was saying, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's like everything we had is slipping away, and I don't know how to get it back." Evan's voice was calm, soothing. "You can't fix it alone, Clara. You have to let go of the past to move forward. You're holding on to a relationship that doesn't serve you anymore." The words hit me like a bullet. Clara was already pulling away from me, already deciding that whatever we had wasn't worth saving. I stepped back from the door, unable to hear anymore. I couldn't take it. I turned and stumbled down the hallway, the anger and heartbreak rising in my chest like a tidal wave. I got back to my car and sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was suffocating in the very air around me. The anger, the betrayal, it was all so much to bear. But worse than that, it was the realization that Clara had already moved on. She had already decided that I wasn't enough for her anymore, and I had been too blind to see it until now. I didn't go home that night. I didn't know if I could face her, if I could look at her and pretend everything was fine. I wasn't sure if I could keep pretending I didn't know what was going on. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. The silence in my car was deafening. The world outside seemed to be moving in slow motion, but in my head everything was a blur. Clara's face, Evan's touch, the words that had shattered everything I thought I knew about our marriage. I had wanted to believe it wasn't true, but the truth was staring me in the face, and I couldn't deny it any longer. I took a deep breath, wiping the tears that had gathered at the corners of my eyes. This wasn't the end of the story. It couldn't be. But it was the beginning of something I hadn't expected. The beginning of a new chapter in my life, and it was going to be a hell of a lot harder than I ever imagined. The moment I saw her walk through the door, my heart dropped into my stomach. Clara had no idea that I knew. She had no idea what I had seen, what I had heard. But it didn't matter. The truth was out, and there was no going back. I watched her for a moment as she set her things down, too casually for someone who was supposed to be hiding something. Her smile, that same smile she had always worn, felt like a mask now. It was thin, too thin. "Hey, Ryan," she said, glancing at me as if everything was normal. But it wasn't. "Clara," I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. I watched her flinch ever so slightly. She knew, I could tell. The air between us felt heavy, like it was thick with everything we hadn't said to each other in the last few weeks. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't hold it back. I stood up, my pulse hammering in my chest. I felt like I was about to explode, but I kept my voice steady, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. "We need to talk." Clara's face tightened, the edges of her smile faltering for the first time. "Ryan, not now. I've had a long day, okay?" "No," I cut in, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Now is exactly when we need to talk." She froze. Her eyes darted to the floor, and I saw the guilt flash behind them. It was all I needed. I had already seen too much, heard too much. But I needed her to admit it. I needed her to say it out loud. "I know about Evan," I said, the name falling from my lips like acid. I felt the weight of it as it sank into the room, suffocating us both. Clara's eyes snapped up to mine, and for a moment she looked like she had been struck. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her lips trembled, and the silence was unbearable. "You're seeing him, aren't you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. But it felt like I had shouted it to the world. My hands were trembling now, clenched into fists at my sides. Her breath hitched. "Ryan, it's not what you think." "No," I said, stepping toward her. My voice grew louder. "It's exactly what I think. I saw you with him. I heard you." The flood of anger and betrayal surged through me, and I didn't care anymore. I needed her to feel it, needed her to understand the depth of what she had done. "You've been lying to me, Clara. You've been sleeping with him, haven't you?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. The guilt in her expression said everything. Her silence screamed louder than any words she could have said. "I can't believe you," I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. "I trusted you. I believed in you. And you went to him instead." My voice broke slightly as the pain of it all rushed in. Clara reached for me, but I pulled back, refusing to let her touch me. "Don't," I said, my voice cold. "Don't touch me." She lowered her hand slowly, her face crumpling as she finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Ryan. I never meant for it to happen, but I needed something more. I felt so alone." She trailed off, her words feeling weak, hollow. I couldn't listen to her excuses anymore. I had heard it all before. The pain in my chest was overwhelming, but something else was growing inside me, something darker. I couldn't let this go, not after everything she had taken from me. "Don't apologize," I said, my tone icy. "It's too late for that." I turned away from her, pacing around the room, my mind racing with the plan that had already started to form in my head. I had to make her feel the same pain she had made me feel. I had to make sure Dennis paid for what he had done, for what he had taken from me too. I walked over to my desk, pulling open a drawer to retrieve my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen as I stared at the number for my lawyer, Wesley Quentin. He was the best in the business, specializing in divorce and domestic disputes. I had worked with him before, and I knew I would need him now. "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, her voice quiet, hesitant. She had finally moved toward me, but she was still afraid to cross the line I had drawn. I didn't look at her as I dialed Wesley's number. "I'm going to make sure this ends. I'm going to make sure you both pay for this." Wesley answered on the second ring. "Ryan, what's going on?" I let out a breath, my mind already focusing on the steps I needed to take. "I need you to start preparing divorce papers, Wesley, and I need to sue Dennis Larkin for alienation of affection. He's the reason this is happening. He needs to be held accountable." Wesley didn't hesitate. "I'll get started right away. We'll hit them both hard. I'll arrange for the paperwork and the restraining order. You'll get everything you deserve." I felt a cold satisfaction wash over me as I hung up the phone. The plan was set. I didn't care how messy it got or how many people were going to get hurt along the way. I had been broken, but now I would rebuild myself, and I would tear Clara's world apart in the process. "You've made your choice," I said, turning to face her, "and now I'm making mine. I'm done with you, Clara." She tried to speak, but I didn't want to hear it anymore. "I'm done," I repeated, my voice final. "Pack your things. You're leaving." As she stood there, speechless, I realized something. I wasn't the man I had been before. I had become someone else, someone who would never forgive, never forget, and I was ready to make her feel the consequences of her betrayal. The more I dug into Dennis Larkin, the more I started to feel a sense of dread settle over me. What had initially seemed like just a simple affair was slowly revealing itself to be a carefully orchestrated web of manipulation. I had always known there were predators out there, people who took advantage of the vulnerable, but this was something different. Dennis wasn't just cheating. He was using his position as a therapist to break people down, to control them. I hadn't fully realized what was at stake until I started putting the pieces together. Clara wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. I started pulling apart the layers of Dennis's life, his professional facade, and I found more than I ever expected. There were whispers I had ignored until now. The case with Janine Linder was just the tip of the iceberg. I spent hours on my laptop, reading through old files, connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. It was there, in the details, that I saw the true scope of Dennis's manipulation. He had done this before, over and over again. Women came to him for help, for healing, and he used their vulnerabilities to prey on them. Each of his patients was a pawn in a game he had mastered, a game where the stakes were emotional destruction. But it wasn't just about sex or power. Dennis's methods were more insidious than that. He was a master at making people doubt themselves, making them question their worth. He used his position of authority as a weapon, convincing women they were broken, convincing them that their marriages were the source of their pain. And once he had them questioning everything they knew, that's when he moved in. The pattern was chillingly clear. There were reports of previous patients who had filed complaints against him, complaints that were mysteriously dropped or settled out of court. Every time there was a payout, a quiet exit, and Dennis moved on to the next vulnerable soul. But this time it wasn't going to be so easy, not with me involved. I felt the anger building inside me again. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. This was bigger. Dennis had crossed a line and he was going to pay for it. But first I needed to know more. I needed to understand how deep this went. I called Izzy. She was the best at digging into people's pasts, especially when it came to uncovering secrets. I need everything on Dennis Larkin, I told her, my voice low and steady, though inside I was seething. Dig up anything you can. His past, his patience, his legal troubles. I want to know exactly who I'm dealing with. I'm on it, Izzy replied. And within minutes I had a flood of information from her. Legal documents, medical licenses, old client testimonials, everything I needed to know. As I skimmed through the files, one particular document stood out. It was an old confidential report detailing a malpractice suit filed by a woman named Rebecca Thompson, a patient of Dennis's who had mysteriously disappeared after her case was dismissed. The language in the report was damning. Rebecca had claimed that Dennis had crossed boundaries, that his behavior had shifted from professional to personal in ways that left her feeling violated. And just like that, the case was closed. No charges, no investigation. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just negligence. It was a pattern of deliberate exploitation. Dennis had covered his tracks so well that no one had ever been able to hold him accountable. But now I had a way in. I had the proof I needed to bring him down. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen in front of me. I couldn't ignore the feeling of betrayal that crept up on me again. Dennis wasn't just some distant figure. He was embedded in my life, in my marriage. He had wormed his way into Clara's world, and now he was the cancer eating away at everything I had built. I didn't know what Clara's role in this was yet. Was she an unwitting victim of his manipulation? Or had she fully embraced the lies he was feeding her? Either way, I wasn't going to let her or him get away with this, not when I had the power to expose the truth. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. There was still a part of me that wanted to believe Clara could be saved from this, that she could see what had really been happening, that she could break free from Dennis's influence. But that part of me was shrinking, fading into the background as the man who had been betrayed took control. I picked up the phone again, this time dialing Wesley's number. I needed him to be ready. We had to hit Dennis hard before he could do any more damage, before Clara could slip any deeper into his web. "I've got everything I need," I said when Wesley answered. "It's time. We're going after him." There was no turning back now. Dennis had made a mistake by getting involved with Clara, and by doing it in the way he had, by using her pain, her vulnerability, he had sealed his own fate. I wasn't going to let him walk away from this. I set the phone down and let out a long, slow breath. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about stopping a man who thought he was untouchable, who thought he could use people for his own selfish desires without consequence. And now, I was going to make him pay. I had never fully realized how alone I'd been until everything started unraveling. The lies, the betrayal, the gnawing sense of being betrayed. It was overwhelming. But there was one person who stood by me, through it all, without hesitation. Danny. She wasn't just my assistant, she was my lifeline. The moment I walked into the office, she looked up from her desk, her eyes scanning my face as if she could read every single thought in my head. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She knew I was in pain, knew something had shifted inside me that would never be the same again. She was there for me in a way that Clara, in her silence and distance, never had been. "Hey, boss," she said softly, her voice breaking through the fog of my thoughts. "You okay?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her how much I was drowning in everything, how much it hurt, but I couldn't, not yet. Instead, I just nodded, the lie coming so easily now that I almost believed it myself. "Yeah, just processing," I muttered, sinking into the chair across from her. Danny didn't buy it, of course. She never did. Her gaze softened as she stood up and walked over to my desk. Without saying another word, she poured me a glass of water and slid it toward me. Her presence was calm, grounding, like a steady anchor in the storm that had become my life. "Processing, huh?" she said with a hint of a smile. "You've been doing a lot of that lately." I chuckled dryly, though it didn't reach my eyes. "What else is there to do?" She sighed and sat down beside me. Danny wasn't like anyone I had ever met. There was something about her that made her unshakable, a quiet strength that resonated in everything she did. She wasn't just a colleague, she was someone I trusted, someone who never wavered, even when the world around me seemed to be falling apart. "I'm here, you know," she said, her voice low, sincere. "I don't know what you're going through, but I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to face this alone." Her words hung in the air between us. They were simple, but they cut through the wall of anger and hurt I had built around myself. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them, without judgment, without trying to fix me. She understood that I didn't need fixing. I just needed someone who saw me, who knew the pain without needing every detail. "I appreciate it, Danny," I said quietly, my voice rougher than I expected. She gave me a knowing look. "I know you do, but you don't need to bottle it all up. You're not a robot, Ryan. You're allowed to be pissed off." I laughed, the sound hollow. "I'm not sure I know how to be anything else right now." Danny studied me for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Then let's do something about it." I raised an eyebrow, uncertain of where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes flashing with determination. "You've got a plan, right? You're going to take down Dennis and get back at Clara, right? Well, I'm with you. All the way." I stared at her, surprised. It wasn't that I didn't trust her, it was just the plan was personal. It wasn't something I had ever envisioned sharing with anyone, let alone her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she was the only one I could trust right now. Clara had turned her back on me, and Dennis was already playing the game. But Danny? She had always been real with me, always stood by me no matter what. "I can't ask you to get involved in this," I said, but I already knew it was too late for that. Danny wasn't going to let me go through this alone, and I wasn't sure I wanted her to. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she replied, her tone sharp, but laced with a softness I couldn't ignore. "You don't have to carry this weight by yourself. Let me help. Let me help take them both down." I was quiet for a long moment, staring at the desk. Her offer was tempting, too tempting, but at the same time I wasn't sure what it would mean to drag her into the chaos that was my life now. "I'm not sure you know what you're asking," I said, my voice lower now. This isn't going to be clean. It's going to get ugly." She gave me a slight smile. "I'm not afraid of ugly. I'm not afraid of you. I'm here to help whether you like it or not." Her words broke through the suffocating silence in my mind. The anger, the pain, they were still there. But Danny's presence was a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to fight back, to regain control of my life. Danny was right. I didn't have to do this alone. I had her, and that meant everything. "I'll need your help," I said finally, the weight of my decision hitting me. "We go after Dennis together, we expose him, and we make sure Clara understands exactly what she's lost." Danny nodded, her eyes filled with an unshakable determination. "We'll make them regret it, Ryan, every last one of them." In that moment, I realized that no matter how messy this got, I had someone in my corner, and that was all I needed to take the next step. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The anger, the betrayal, the sense of helplessness had simmered beneath the surface, fueling every decision I made. It was no longer just about Clara or Dennis, or even the destruction of my marriage. It was about justice, about making them feel the consequences of their actions. And now the time had come. Izzy had dug deep. finding everything I needed to destroy Dennis's carefully built facade. His malpractice suits, his secretive behavior with patients, the pattern of manipulation that he had gotten away with for years. It was all there, like a blueprint of his deceit. The weight of what we were about to do didn't hit me until I was sitting in Wesley's office, staring at the divorce papers and the lawsuit forms that were going to change everything. The idea of revenge was no longer a fleeting thought. It had become a plan, a calculated legal strike that would leave Dennis and Clara with nothing but their own guilt to keep them company. But as I sat there, surrounded by legal documents and plans for restraining orders, I realized how far this had taken me. "Are you sure about this, Ryan?" Wesley's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. His eyes, usually so professional, were now clouded with concern. "This isn't going to be easy. This could get ugly, and you're opening up a lot of wounds." I met his gaze, feeling the weight of the decision on my shoulders. "I don't care anymore," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I've been betrayed in every way possible. They need to pay for what they've done. This isn't about getting back at Clara or getting back at Dennis. This is about making sure this never happens to anyone else." Wesley nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "All right, Ryan. We'll do this your way." It was time to make them feel the full force of their actions. The plan was simple but precise. First, we would serve Clara with the divorce papers and a restraining order against Dennis. Then we would file the lawsuit against him for alienation of affection, which in this case wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was about his manipulation, his deceit, and his abuse of power. But it wasn't just about the legal action. There was more. I had made sure that Dennis's dirty little secrets were going to be exposed. His past patients, the ones he had manipulated, the ones he had hurt, all of them would know the truth. No more hiding behind his credentials. No more pretending that he was the healer when, in reality, he was the one causing the damage. I felt the weight of every document I signed, knowing that they were going to destroy everything Dennis had worked for. His reputation, his career, gone in an instant. But it wasn't enough to just expose him. I needed him to suffer. I needed him to know what it felt like to lose everything. The door to Wesley's office opened, and I looked up to see Izzy walking in, her expression determined. She didn't need to say anything. I could see the fire in her eyes. She was in this with me all the way. "Everything's set," she said, her voice crisp. "Dennis won't know what hit him." I nodded, feeling a sense of cold satisfaction flood through me. "Good. Let's make sure he regrets ever crossing me." The next few hours were a blur. Wesley made the calls, ensuring that the papers were filed and that everything was set in motion. Izzy worked with me to gather the last of the evidence, making sure nothing was overlooked. We were ready. All that was left was the final push. As the sun began to set, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. The rage that had driven me for weeks had dulled, replaced with something else. Something final. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was closure. I sat back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. "It's done," I muttered. Izzy gave me a small smile. "Now we wait." And as much as I wanted to feel triumphant, as much as I wanted to savor the satisfaction of bringing them to their knees, I couldn't help but feel something else, something deeper. I had won, yes, but at what cost? I thought about Clara. I thought about what this would mean for her, for our past. Maybe I'd never know her the way I once had. Maybe she would never understand the full extent of what she had done. But the truth was, I didn't need her to. I had already let go. I had already moved on. As the first papers were served and the legal process began, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I was still standing at the edge, looking down into the abyss of what had been my life. But for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel lost. I felt like I had a purpose again. And for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The days that followed were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. The divorce was inevitable, but the weight of it still crushed me. I had spent so many years building my life around Clara, around the idea of us, that the reality of our separation hit harder than I had anticipated. But now, it was out of my hands. The restraining order against Dennis had been served, the divorce papers were signed, the lawsuits were filed, the truth was out, and yet it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like anything I could celebrate. What did victory even look like in a situation like this? I had spent so much time focusing on retribution, on making Clara and Dennis feel the consequences of their actions, that I had neglected the most important thing, myself. The anger that had driven me for so long had burned itself out, leaving me feeling hollow. There was no satisfaction in seeing Dennis fall, no peace in watching Clara face the reality of what she had done. I couldn't remember the last time I had truly smiled. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the revenge, the heartbreak, had left me exhausted. But something inside me was beginning to stir. Something small, something hopeful. I had taken control of my life again, and now I needed to rebuild. Izzy had been there for me every step of the way. She was a rock, a constant presence that kept me grounded. We had spent countless hours working through the legal mess, gathering evidence and strategizing. But now that the storm was over, I realized just how much she had come to mean to me. It wasn't just her loyalty or her support, or even her fierce determination. It was the way she understood me without needing words. She never pushed me to talk about things I wasn't ready to share. She just stood by me. And in a world that had been turned upside down, that had been more than enough. We had dinner together a few nights after everything had been finalized. I couldn't remember the last time I had sat down for a meal without the constant weight of worry pressing down on me. The conversation was easy, flowing without effort. Izzy had this way of making everything feel normal again, like the world outside could still be good. "You're going to be okay, you know," she said, her eyes soft as she looked at me across the table. "I can see it in you. You've taken a lot of hits, but you're not broken. You're stronger than you think." I met her gaze, feeling something shift inside me. It wasn't the same way I had once looked at Clara. It wasn't that overwhelming love or the need to hold on to something that was slipping away. No, this was different. This was something real, a connection that felt like it had been there all along, even if I hadn't recognized it until now. "I'm not sure I feel strong," I confessed quietly, pushing the food around on my plate. "I feel lost. Like I don't know who I am without all the anger, all the revenge. It was the only thing that kept me going." Izzy reached across the table, her hand brushing mine in a way that sent a jolt through me. "You don't need all that, Ryan. You're better than that. It's over. Now it's time to live." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight. She was right. I had spent so much time thinking about what I had lost, what I had been wronged, that I had forgotten what I had. I had forgotten that there was still life left to live, that there was still time to find happiness again. "I don't know how to let go," I admitted, feeling the truth of those words in my chest. "It's like I can't move on from all the pain." Izzy smiled, her expression gentle but firm. "You don't have to let go of everything at once. Just take it one step at a time. Start with forgiving yourself." I wanted to argue, wanted to say that forgiveness was for the weak, but I couldn't. Not when I looked into her eyes and saw the sincerity there. Not when I realized that the first person I needed to forgive was myself. The next few weeks were quiet. I started to rebuild my life piece by piece. The detective agency was busy, but it didn't consume me the way it had before. I took time for myself. I spent more time with Izzy, who had become something more than just a colleague to me. We took a trip together, a weekend getaway to the coast. It was the first time in months that I had felt like I could breathe again. We spent our days walking along the beach, talking about everything and nothing. And when the sun set, we sat in silence, watching the waves crash against the shore. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture. It wasn't the start of some whirlwind romance. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward, like I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't sure where this was going. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that. I was taking it one step at a time, and that was enough. What do you think of Ryan's journey for revenge and justice? Do you agree with his decisions, or do you think he took it too far? From which region are you watching this video? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can follow all our future stories. And make sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.